So is everyone almost ready?
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, the boyfriend's just making me a sandwich because I'm starving.
So that's what he's been reduced to.
All right, I think we're ready.
Before I started this, so cool. What are you guys doing?
We said we were getting ready. We're ready.
Any case.
Well, I should get on.
Do it. Do it, bitch.
I should get my.
Welcome to Inside Movies Galore, episode number 19,
Yes.
where we discuss film Tokyo Zombie, which is directed by Sakichi Sato. And it was originally a manga written in 1999.
Oh, I did not know that.
By Yusaku Hanakuma. And it basically, even though it was released in Japan in 2005, it came to America, UK, Australia, and New Zealand in 2009. So the movie stars Tadanobu Asano, Sho Akawa, and Erika Okuda. And it basically is about two worker bums who work in a fire extinguisher plant.
Worker bums who work.
And somehow nearby there is a black mountain of trash that evidently turns people into zombies.
The whole thing doesn't make much sense.
It doesn't really make much sense because it is part comedy and part animation. So, Celeste, when were you engrossed by this film? When did you see it the first time? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your first encounter with the film?
Well, especially because you suggested it.
I did. I only saw it one time back in 2009 when it first came out. And I feel like I'd missed a bunch of it. Like I hadn't maybe paid full attention. So it was always kind of stuck in my brain. I was like, I really need to rewatch that movie.
Okay. And now that you've rewatched it, what did you think of it?
It was better than I remembered.
Okay.
It's a masterpiece.
What attracted it to you to begin with?
It was just funny. It was really like kind of dumb sense of humor, but it was funny. I just really liked how automatically abusive every character was right off the bat to each other.
Is there a favorite scene that you'd like to share before I go on to one of these other dunderheads?
I really like the scene where they're burying the guy's mom and the girl kicks her head off.
Okay. Alrighty. Dane, why don't you tell me, was this your first time seeing the film?
It was. I finished it just a little while ago. And,
okay.
Yeah, I'm a slacker on that level.
So what were your thoughts to this version of a zombie film?
Well, it reminded me a lot of Shaun of the Dead, except I like this significantly more than Shaun of the Dead because I felt, well, for several reasons. One, I think this took a lot more risks in terms of its humor and its storytelling. I liked that it did not conform to traditional methods of telling a story, which is largely because it was adapted from a manga. I like that the zombies did not look like your standard Western versions of what zombies look like. And I liked that it took, I don't know, I like watching films that are so decidedly not Western because I feel like you learn a lot more about film that way. And because Shaun of the Dead, it kind of was a good like baseline for modern horror comedy, what that looks like. But to me, it's a baseline. I like stuff that goes above and beyond, and I feel like this was significantly more risky, and I think it did a lot more that I was pleased to see. And I just like Japanese humor as well. I think that the Japanese do really that I've seen the Japanese horror that I've seen has been really good, and having watched a lot of anime and things like that, I've gotten used to Japanese humor, and it was a good blending of those things while also telling a good story, despite the fact that it observes cartoon physics with the like Celeste was saying, kicking the mom's head off and things like that. It's very cartoony in the Western sense of cartoony, but also it's very Japanese in its humor.
Okay.
It was pretty Japanese, yeah.
And I mean that in the best possible way, because I love anime and love Japanese, obviously video games and the culture and all that stuff. So,
Dustin, was this your first time viewing this film now that you've spoken up?
Yeah, so I didn't really have any idea what to expect, and well, it was weird. Well, I'll just say it. I didn't necessarily enjoy it all that much, but it did have some pretty great moments, like Celeste was saying, with like the like, wow, what's going on? And there were quite a few like cultural things that were, just because it was Japanese that I didn't quite understand. It's like there's a moment like later on where somebody is like growling on the ground, and it's like, I guess like a normal kind of like show of respect or something.
Yeah, I don't think it was. I think it was overacted on purpose. But from my knowledge of Japanese culture, like your superiors, your elders, whatever, if they're viewed as a higher class than you, you actually will grovel to them to some extent.
By the way, folks, this is Andrew. Andrew, this is your first time on the show,
right.
Is it not?
Yeah, first time.
Welcome to the show. By the way,
it should be said about Japanese humor that they don't really have any real sense of restraint, at least not in comparison to American style of humor.
Yeah.
That's especially true in anime. Like, if depending on the style of anime, of course, because there's plenty of like really dead serious anime, and then there's stuff that's openly comedic, and then there's some variation in between. But like I'm thinking about a show like Yu Yu Hakusho, which had a lot of serious elements, but it could also be really.
Oh yeah, well, they could be goofy. Swambalgy or something that would be good to remember from that.
But like you know how they'd have recurring gags about like a pan would fall on someone's head out of nowhere, or like just things like that. All the exaggerated facial features, and the people would scream at each other like with all of their might randomly, and just things like that. If you're used to that, then the style of humor and the style of acting should not come as too much of a surprise for you.
There was actually one element that really surprised me because of that. When the bald mentor character got his ankle bitten and totally underplays it.
Yeah.
It's just like,
get off.
And
That was funny.
totally unexpected as far as all of the other things that Japanese humor generally does.
Yeah, I like that everybody was an asshole and a pervert.
Yeah, that's Japanese tropes, like especially the pervy elder, or like the kind of, oh man, one of my favorite moments that was kind of a throwaway, but I was like, this is so unbelievably Japanese that it's amazing, was when the school kids robbed the teacher or whatever, and they're like really polite about it, and they're like, we didn't have money for a gun, and so they use scissors, and then the boy like bows as he's leaving, and then the teacher's wanting to like touch the little girl, but they get eaten by zombies and stuff, and it just like that is so beautifully Japanese. I love it.
Like, I mostly just don't understand it, because it's like, this stuff is like happening out on the streets, but they censored their porn. Like, I don't understand.
It's a different world over there, but speaking of which,
there definitely seem to be a lot of perverts out there.
Well, speaking of which, I really liked. I really like the fact that the zombies are decidedly not Western, uh, decayed flesh. You know, which is, again, we when we talked about Night of the Living Dead, we talked about the fact that in that movie they were called ghouls, which is what the zombie traditionally that we know of today. That's technically that's the proper name, but nobody says that anymore. But I like the fact that even though they were undead and flesh eating, I like the fact that they looked a lot more like Japanese yurei, which are essentially ghosts. But that look got popularized in kabuki theater, so it was the pale face, the black hair, you know, limp
Which
arms, whatever
which
it
is
is.
why this kind of made me remind me of one of my favorite Japanese films that was originally called Fantasy Mission Force with Jackie Chan
Mm-hmm.
from 1984, which there is a scene in the film where they're spending a night in a haunted house, and there's this Japanese like urukai guy just kind of like bending down and looking at them and just jumping along the way, and you know that's the typical Japanese you know taking the ghost into their most serious form.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you guys know the film or whatnot, but it was one of my cheesy favorites from back in the day.
But I like that they had that look, and I liked that. I have to say also, I love the fact that the second half of the film does completely change what you would expect. It goes away from like your standard zombie apocalypse tropes, and then goes into a lot of social satire about the upper classes and about kind of obviously gladiatorial, you know, stuff as well. And yeah, I like that it willing to go there, but also like a lot of the characters and a lot of the I could just I think it was a manga, and then they just went straight to a live action film. I don't think they did an anime in between, because oftentimes when something's a manga, they oftentimes do an anime before they do a live action film.
I think
there is an anime now, because when I was looking it up, I thought I saw something about a Tokyo Zombie anime.
Unless
did it come out?
Unless it might have been the animation in between.
I saw some screenshots.
Yeah, because usually it goes manga, then anime, and then
live, whatever.
Which sometimes the anime and the manga can be concurrent. But bottom line is that just by the way the characters look, their behavior, and just the design of everything, I was like, I could have easily pictured this on Toonami back in the day, or maybe Adult Swim.
One thing I sort of noticed during like the animated sequence was, what is it with that particular hairstyle and like the red jacket? Is it just like an Akira thing, or does anybody know why that seems to appear so much?
What is that haircut?
Well, it looks like a pompadour, at least to us, but
or yeah.
I don't know. I think it would just kind of became a trope, I guess. I mean,
like you could kill somebody.
There's a lot of anime hairstyles that have caught on for various kinds of characters, and I guess that's just one of them, because I've seen that same hairstyle pop up a lot of different other places.
Hairstyle, wasn't it?
Andrew, what was this your first time seeing the film?
Yes, it was. I had no idea what to think, and just the dichotomy between the first half and the second half was really striking. Like the characters were still having the same dynamics, but I think that's the first zombie movie where I've seen where it actually spends the entire first half on this, like the start of the rise of the zombies, and then goes into the dystopian aftermath, and spends a fairly equal amount of time on both. That was kind of fun to watch.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It was also kind of the way that the split kind of worked on me was like the first half. I mean, there were good jokes, but it felt kind of like a lower tier like zombie movie. It's like, yeah, I've seen all this before. You know, it's not. Oh, I can like, you know, clean up some papers or, you know, like bake something and not necessarily miss all too much. And then the second half happened. And it's like, wait, what?
And then all of a sudden it turns into Turbo Kid Arena combat.
Yeah, and it's suddenly a fairly unique movie, and it's like, oh, okay, what's happening? It's almost, this kind of happened when I saw Cabin in the Woods without knowing like the thing about Cabin in the Woods, and it's like, okay, this is just like a normal like movie. This kind of sucks. What's going on? Oh!
Well, to be honest, this was actually my first time watching the film. It
What do you
was
think?
actually in my collection. Well, the first, because I watched it twice. I watched it once last night with my fiance, and she totally did not like it at all. I watched it, and I liked certain things about it. Now that I've watched it again this morning, there are actually moments that I liked about the film too. It's the corniness that I liked, and there were 3 moments. That first one with that the kicking of the mother-in-law. I'm sorry, but everyone has had a moment in their life where they just do not disagree with their parents and wanted to bury them in a hunk of sand and kick their head off. I'm
Just
sorry.
one, huh?
The second part that I found funny was the part where she called both the owner of the arena and the other guy, you idiot! But you are, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
And then the last part that I thought was funny was the part where he realized that they were all leaving to go to what is it, Russia?
That was pretty random.
That was random.
Go north.
But,
it's north. Russia. Okay.
And he was running after them, and he jumped onto the thing in the end, and that was that part I felt funny. So at first I thought it was stupid, but then I watched it again and thought that it was a little bit more funny than stupid.
One of my favorite comedy tropes is when you have 2 characters who are really dumb, but you have one character who's just slightly smarter than the other or is dumb in a different way. And I like that you had...
he's dumb but a little wiser.
Yeah, like you had Mitsuo, who always thought he had stomach cancer when he didn't, and
he also thought he was a zombie, and he wasn't, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That I thought was
and then of course he thought he got bitten, and the lady ended up having like dentures.
Yeah. Which I like the fact that they were both dumb, but in very different ways, and I do think that can work really well for a comedy device. And I really liked the fact that they kind of, in a weird way, were making fun of something that I was complaining to a friend of mine today about, how I really can't stand it when in movies when the leading man and the leading lady end up together for no other reason than they're just the leading man and the leading lady. But I like the fact that that's kind of what happens, but they really don't like each other, and yet they have a kid, but they also still live together out of...
and they don't realize that they love each other or what.
Yeah, but it's
Do you
just
like me? Do you like our daughter? More.
They live together just kind of out of necessity because of this, horrible situation that they're in. But it's just...
Do you like me?
Yeah.
It's kind of sold as a romantic ending, but it isn't, because they hate each other and they're abusive to each other.
Yeah, I found that really amusing personally, because I really can't... Well, because I really cannot stand that trope in movies when the romance isn't earned and they're just together just because.
Same here.
Yeah.
Did they entirely earn it, do you think, through the film, though?
Well, I like that they arrive there by a different means, by means that are unexpected, but I feel like they're this... they feel like the same people.
The guy only saved her because he thought she was hot, and then he ended up dying anyway.
Well, actually, he promised Mitsuo that he would actually
saved her because he thought she was hot.
Well, yeah, and Fujio saved her Mitsuo's promise to take care of her.
Yeah, but I liked her too, just because I don't know, she had some personality, and I like that she could knock him through the house wall and things like that. Again, it's very Japanese, but I did like the fact that they were pretty spectacularly making fun of that trope.
Andrew,
And yet it completely worked for the characters.
Yeah,
Andrew, what did you think of the whole romance going on there with Fujio and Ishihara there?
Well, I really wish I knew culturally more of what was possibly going on there. It may have been an expected marriage for all I know, but I'm just kind of at a loss culturally, and I'd like to know more about that possibly. So I'll have to ask around to look that up. But when it switched up and they were together, I actually kind of did a double take, and I'm like, wait, they're actually still together? What did I miss? Because it's just like animation 5 years, and fast forward and boom, same actors.
It's almost like they ran out of money to do the rest of the film, and then did an animation to try to skip over some of that part that they
some of the
couldn't
exposition,
come up with, and then that's why the second half is like totally in the future. That's also a possibility.
I also want to bring that up in the context of what Dane mentioned earlier with like how they did their zombies, because I mean, you read into like some cultural things about like Japanese ghosts,
right?
Whereas I thought they were just kind of like budget Night of the Living Dead zombies, where they just kind of like paint them gray, you know. So that was the impression I got, but I didn't know more.
They were literally.
If you look up Yurei, it's if you look up Yurei, they have that very standard look, and it's been ingrained in their culture for a long time. And also in Japan, the color white is very opposite the way it is here. Like how in America or in Western culture, the character in white is good, and the character in black is bad. There, it's the opposite. The character in white is bad. And so I think part of the reason why the ghosts have pale skin on top of being dead, but usually the Yurei, they wear white, and so in this case, their clothing doesn't change, but their skin color definitely does. And that was also my first clue that, what's his name? Mitsuo, that was my first clue that he wasn't actually a zombie, because his, skin color was normal. But there is definitely a cultural precedent for it. And I was nice to see that they carried it over into their zombie design. I think other Japanese zombie movies, if I'm not mistaken, have done things similar to that.
Which I think there is one movie that comes to mind. I'm not sure the year, but right offhand, but I think it's called Kung Fu Zombie.
Mm-hmm.
That might have some Urukai zombies in there. I'm not sure as far as recent zombie films per se, but it's definitely worth a look-see in the future to see if there are. And I know there's a classic anthology that I want to eventually get to. It's called Kwaidan.
If you look up a lot of Japanese horror monsters, ones that come from folklore and from their stuff that's unique to Japan, you will notice that they've had dragons and demons and stuff like their version of demons, like Oni, those look and behave very different from the Judeo-Christian ones, and and even the concept of demons doesn't really hold the same context there as it does here.
Thinking back to Yu Hakusho, like you said earlier, like with the yokai.
Demons can be good, bad, neutral. It's more like saying spirits, really.
Exactly.
But in any case, yeah, that's. I always like diving into another culture that I have a I have a familiarity with, so I'm not like completely lost, but at the same time it's a very refreshing thing when you see a story that has been familiar to us in the form of stuff like Shaun of the Dead, or other zombie apocalypse comedies like Zombieland, but you see it done in a much different, more risky fashion. It's kind of funny. Compare this movie, Tokyo Zombie, to Zombieland and to Shaun of the Dead, and they all they all represent very country specific styles of humor. I notice,
Right.
like I think Zombieland is very American, especially like with
Got a cowboy searching for
what's his name? Woody Harrelson's character is very American, and then you have Shaun of the Dead, which is about as British as can be, and then obviously this is very Japanese in its humor. So that's very interesting, but they do hit some similar story points. I think Zombieland's probably the most different out of those three, but
also a realization that I made after I had seen it today once again, and I believe that Fujio's stupidity was actually blocked by that childhood incident that he had with his teacher, and I think he couldn't get past that incident. So when he realized it at the end, it's quite possible that towards the end he could have overcome that stupidity, even though he still does not know kung fu or jujitsu.
Yeah, he's not a smart character. That's fairly obvious. I think the girl is smarter than him, and that possibly the daughter is smarter than both of them. But I thought it was funny that they had a daughter because they're just talking normally, and then all of a sudden they reference the girl. And she's just sitting there, and she looks like traumatized through most of the movie.
Which is probably why she can't or won't talk,
Yeah. I wouldn't.
Well, she was. I believe she was the high-speaking voice during the animation, I think.
Yeah, I thought that too once I saw the character and she talked at the end, then I was like, oh, that's the voice.
Oh, she's the narrator.
Which I don't... The version that you sent us, David, was dubbed, and I don't... I
missed out on that.
Now, I don't mind dubbing when it comes to comedies, just because comedy is often very verbal, but... But
that's another point that we can talk about. Do you prefer it in a Japanese film to read it more than watch it, or watch it more than read it, or watch it both at the same time?
Generally speaking, I much prefer to hear movies in their native language and read subtitles. Yeah. But for comedy, that's one. And anime is different because anime is meant to be dubbed into any language, just by its very design. Even then, I like to hear it in its original Japanese. But a good American dub is fine if they have one. But for comedy, I find that if you have a decent dub, then it can be funny. Like I watched City Hunter with Jackie Chan, which was also a manga adaptation. That was really funny when it was dubbed. But the point I was going to make was that because this was dubbed into English, and I didn't look up the English dub cast, but certainly the tropes and the kind of voices I was hearing, I was like, yeah, these guys, these people could easily be English anime dub actors. Because especially like the little girl voice, I was like, yeah, that's very familiar. At least that kind of voice is very familiar for anime characters, because there's very specific kinds of voices that you hear when you watch anime dubbed into English. That's why it's kind of refreshing whenever you would refreshing, but also I guess a little distracting when you would see the when you'd see the American, hang on, I hear myself going.
Oh, I'm drunk again. No.
Okay.
When
I hear myself, whenever you could hear the American releases of the Studio Ghibli movies, and you would hear some celebrity voices and stuff. Sometimes that'd be kind of cool. Sometimes it'd be distracting, but it was refreshing to hear other kinds of voices. But for this anyway, I don't know if they were some of the familiar players, but certainly the types of voices I thought were very familiar for the ones I've heard for the English dubs for anime.
Well, with personally for me with dubbing, you can understand me, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. This is a great test. This is working good. So personally for me with dubbing, it sort of depends on the subject matter. Like, for example, Gojira or M, both like very good movies from their respective cultures. I don't mind watching those in the original language with the subtitles, because I want to understand the piece of art as it was meant to be understood. Whereas with something like this, I would almost prefer a dub to the original language, because it feels almost less important to understanding the work. Let me phrase it that way. Like, it's not as serious a thing. Like, you're not supposed to like sit back and think about like the deep allegorical themes.
So you're actually glad that you were able to see it dubbed.
I probably would not have been willing to watch it in the original language because it would have been.
Are you saying it makes the comedy more of a comedy and less of an intellectual thought piece?
Exactly. Like, because if I have to focus and read on something, I'm going to be using that part of my mind to interpret it. And with something like this, I would have been bored beyond belief, I'm sure.
Sure.
Whereas, also, kind of going back to anime dubbing too, I prefer the dubbing simply so that I don't have to like sit and like read for certain things.
It does take away from the visual effect.
Exactly, and that's a lot of it. Like, I mean, with say Lupin the Third can be goofy and really smart. So I'm okay with reading like a dub for that. So I'm okay with reading the subtitles for something like that, or for Cowboy Bebop. Whereas Dragon Ball Super, I don't watch that for the deep. Yeah. So like I just want to see Goku punch Frieza in the face, you know. And well, he deserves it despite how cool Frieza is, but still. Digression.
He's a cooler.
If you know, it's a long story.
I make intolerable puns all the time. My apologies.
He's really good at it. Good at it. Too good at it. Anyway, so yeah, I didn't mind that this was dubbed, and it's only kind of on a handful of occasions where I prefer the original language version. So it depends. Long story short, it depends on the quality of the art that I'm viewing.
Okay.
So
Celeste.
Yes.
About dubbing and subtitles, which do you prefer?
I like subtitles almost all the time. I think dubbing can sometimes be really funny, like with pod people. But most of the time, I'd prefer the original voices and just read it if I don't know the language.
Well, wouldn't you agree that there's a music to the language, the original language?
Yeah, it just sort of you get a sense of the original voices and what it's supposed to sound like, and
yeah. Well, and it's like I watched French films, Italian, Japanese. It's like Chinese. It's like they have their own sounds, and I think that you don't even necessarily have to understand the words, but you like it just from hearing them. But I think it's important to expose yourself to just the sounds, let alone here's a good example. The Passion of the Christ was in Aramaic and Latin, which are two dead languages that nobody speaks today. But technically speaking, the lingua franca at that time was classical Greek. So that would have been 3 languages, but keeping it to as slightly historically inaccurate as it was,
Sure.
the sounds of the 2 languages contrast pretty significantly, and so that was largely was Mel Gibson's intention. There was to have the differences in the sounds of the language be a point of focus. And that's part of why I think it's important to hear things in their language, because I think it gives you a lot of different layers of enjoyment and cultural exposure. Um, but and I just think it gives more respect to the way that to the way that the film was originally meant to be seen. Not to mention the fact that even with anime, which generally speaking, there's a fairly healthy English dub, industry at like places like Funimation and stuff like that. I'll tell you what, I saw Ghost in the Shell, the original 1995 film. Saw it on the big screen for the first time, and it had an English dub, which I thought was so low energy and so not good. Yeah, it just was not good. I'm sorry. The dub was, and I was like, I want to see this in its original language because I feel like this dub was just so emotionless. So
Ah,
yeah, that can really hurt a movie if the dub's bad, or it can make something unintentionally funny, if it's done poorly.
that is something I wanted to bring up, but had kind of forgotten to. Like I lost my train of thought. Sometimes when something is dubbed, what they change can alter the whole story.
Yeah.
The best example I know of is going back to Dragon Ball Z, the movie Cooler's Revenge. So in the dub, it's kind of like he just shows up. It's, I want revenge on Goku because you beat up my brother, or like. Whereas in like the original Japanese language, like reading the subtitles, it's more deep than that. Like it has a strong tie to kind of like the honor culture sort of thing. Oh, you disgraced my family, and it's like it was almost a completely different movie because the villain's motivations made far, far more sense.
Well,
Um,
and let's not forget the recent example, another anime I saw on the big screen. Let's not forget the recent example of the brand new English dub of Sailor Moon R, the movie, where all of the original homosexual subtext was brought back, as opposed to the original English dub release of the film, where it was like a friendship, and they have to do all this weird dancing around of things, and I think in the original Japanese, 2 of the Sailor Scouts were lesbian lovers, and then in the English dub they're like sisters or something. But it's like sometimes in the translation they can either make something completely different, or they can censor things and kind of hurt the original themes of the movie, or things like that. So it's a very slippery slope, I have to say, and that's just with anime, let alone what could be done with a live action film.
well, a lot of
Andrew?
times. Huh?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, a lot of. I'll be fast.
Go ahead.
A lot of times with anime,
Go ahead.
I kind of anime seems to have kind of no rules. So a lot of times, if I see something that I think is really weird in anime, I'll just be like, "Oh, it's anime," or like early on when it's like, "I'm your boss, do what I say," and he's just like on top of the guy, like beating on him. It's like, yeah, Japan, okay. Anyway.
Andrew, what do you think about and the subtitles? Which do you prefer?
I almost exclusively prefer subtitles over dubbing, and I'm one of those weird people who, if I'm watching again, if I have the option, sometimes I will watch subtitles and dubbing at the same time, just to see the little inconsistencies, because it's interesting to see how the voice actors will rephrase things. And I'm making the assumption here that dubbing is more correct than the subbing, but which isn't always true. But it's really interesting to see how just those tiny little details can be changed.
Well, and I remember the VHS stage when we used to get the VHS versions of
Where you
Godzilla.
get you get what you get. Yeah.
You get what you get, and you see the lips moving a mile away from the words, and it's just comic.
Yeah.
You know? In fact, I almost wish that they come out with like a whole Blu-ray collection of the entire Godzilla series with the original dubbing in it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's
they have
not.
a handful of those out, but they're not exactly good. Like somebody needs to, Toho needs to really like crack down on that and release like a big set. It would not be cheap at all.
Let's not forget also, this is something that happens in dubbing, but it can also happen. It can happen with text too, whether it's movies or video games or something. But even more so than just the translation is the localization. So they will try to, in translation, sometimes certain things will not make the cut. Or like there will be attempts to localize it for an American audience that will sometimes fall flat. Like in one of the Godzilla movies, I think it was Godzilla 1985, they make a reference to one of the soldiers being named Major Spielberg, as a reference to Steven Spielberg's father, who was in World War II, which just kind of comes off as weird. Or like the joke I'll never forget, because I saw this movie in the theater, was Pokemon, the first movie, where they say, I didn't know Vikings existed today. They mostly do it. They mostly do it in Minnesota, and I'm like, that joke was so not there in the original language. I guarantee you, but it just comes off as weird whenever that happens. So that's another precarious slippery slope that could happen. Or I'll tell you what was also weird was I was watching a Fistful of Dollars for the first time, and I rented it from the library at college, and it was an old VHS copy, and I have not seen it since, like on Blu-ray or anything, but they had people speaking English, but then they also had people speaking another
Italian.
language. Yeah, I assume it was Italian, but it was dubbed into English. So, but I've also, that was before I knew about how in Italy they would do that, where they'd have the actors speak their native language and they would dub it into whatever language they needed. Subsequently,
That
Yeah,
made
that was-
Zombie 2 really weird to me.
that was before I knew that. So I was thinking,
Not even the worst.
was this I was like, were they too lazy to put in subtitles here, or what? Because it just came off as jarring, because you had other people like Clint Eastwood who spoke perfect English, and again, I grew up on the Godzilla movies, which were dubbed into English, and that was some of the times that Westerners were first exposed to Japanese cinema that was dubbed into English, and so that's where the jokes came through. But yeah, that to me there are just too many reasons to not dub, or to not. I mean, and again, I've watched a lot of movies that were dubbed, but it's just the potential for things to go wrong.
Watched a film only another language, and they dubbed it, and they did so bad on the dubbing that you wish that they could have put subtitles in. I've had that.
What? Oh, right.
I thought the Ghost in the Shell English dub was pretty bad, but I don't know if it was like funny. It wasn't funny bad though.
What was in this movie? What was that drink that guy was obsessed with, or whatever he was trying to find?
I assumed it was
Yeah.
alcohol. Like, we could not figure that out. Like, what was he screaming about? Say something?
I remember it as kombucha, but that's the only thing. It wasn't that. I'm just gonna call it kombucha.
Oh,
Good enough.
the dude in the bus.
Yeah,
The dude who's on the bus.
yeah, that guy.
Something on the equivalent level of like absinthe or something like that.
Yeah, some at least semi-addictive substance is what it appeared to be. So, and what
I don't know.
technically is. So it could have been something alcoholic.
That was a random thing, though. That they stuck in there.
Yeah, it was really random and weird.
They might have just needed a MacGuffin and just threw that in there for it, whatever it happens to be. I'm really surprised, speaking of like subbing and dubbing, that they didn't explain what it was at any given point. It's just like, we want thing! We're gonna blow up building to get the thing! It could have been anything. It could have been, you know, like the scientist's necromantic staff. I don't know.
Or they could have at least got a Japanese like commercial interrupt the darn thing to explain.
Could have been.
It.
Maybe it was Powerade or Pepsi. I don't know. Only the rich people now have Powerade.
Ultimately, did everyone like the film?
Yes.
Yeah, I quite enjoyed it, and I have to say, I also thought that despite it being a rather goofy comedy, I did like that it was going for an actual dramatic character arc. Of course, it kind of, you know, it went there in its own way, but you know what it honestly reminded me of in terms of the kind of character arc. It actually kind of reminded me of Dumb and Dumber a little bit, in the sense that both characters were very dumb. They had a very unique friendship, and there were actual character arcs that were accomplished in both films, and yet it was still a goofy comedy. So I do like that whenever you can have comedies that do work as movies with real character arcs and characters that you find interesting and that kind of stuff.
Now, go ahead. Oh, yeah, that's my echo.
Yeah.
My bad. There are actually two other movies that I can think of, and I believe they're both South Korean, that follow the roles of the dumb character, we'll just say, where there is significant character development. And one of those was The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. And the other one, you'll have to help me out. The Weird?
The Bad, the Weird.
I'm sorry. The Good, the Bad, the Weird, was a playoff. I'm sorry. The Good, the Bad, the Weird. It was an Eastern Western, in short terms. But the main character of that, he just plays this totally incompetent and surprisingly lucky character. And then as the movie goes along, you figure out he's kind of dumb. He's beaten on by his superior, so to speak. And then it turns out, no, he's actually a quite skilled character. And I'm not going to say much more, so I don't spoil anything. And then the other one was it was a fairly classic Japanese-style monster flick. Dustin, you'll have to help me out. They had The Gas Banana.
The Host?
The Host, thank you. And in The Host, the main character was also, you know, sort of, he was viewed as an incompetent dumbass, but really he did have a skill. Just like in this movie, the main character, they keep haranguing him like he doesn't really know the art of jujitsu and stuff. Yep, there's The Host. And all of that stuff. But he's, despite how dumb they portray him to be, he really does have actual applicable skill. It's just he's so undervalued by the other people, and that really helps out with the character development.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and let's not forget, and these are Hong Kong films I'm about to reference, but Shaolin Soccer and Kung Fu Hustle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those were good. Like, I mean, they were both kind of martial arts comedies, but they again had characters who were dumb or not all that desirable,
but with incredible capabilities.
Oh yeah, well, but they went through actual character arcs amidst the jokes, which is sort of the point, because oftentimes the weakness that you run into with comedy, because it's so subjective, is like, oh, you know, it's funny because of this person who's not supposed to be doing this is doing this, but they don't really change, or, you know, things like that, because again, it's very subjective, but sometimes that's a crutch to where they don't completely work as movies, but when they do and they are funny, then that's a great thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a movie in which one of the characters is just like, oh, I'm an idiot, I'm going to luck out in every scenario. And then he's like directly challenged by people who want to fight him. He's like, "These fools are going to die." Like it just completely changes because the character's only been pretending to be an idiot this entire time.
And then he just defeats them in one punch.
More or less.
Well, in any case, did anyone else have anything else to add?
Andrew, talk about the fighting.
Oh yeah. So I have admittedly limited experience in martial combat, but I have
Limited meaning a lot.
comparatively.
It's a lot.
I'm at the point where I know enough to know how much I don't know. I've dabbled in multiple different arts, and when I have not done jujitsu, but when the master and the student were fighting in both in the beginning and in that paralleled end scene in the arena, they were both using legitimate martial arts stuff. Like, it may have seemed kind of fumbly and stuff when they were on the ground and they were just like pushing an arm off, or all of a sudden the roles just kind of awkwardly switched and the other guy was on top. That appeared to be actual jujitsu, which actually a lot of the moves appeared to be genuine martial arts if it was not jujitsu. And the fact that they put such a not spoken, but in the fighting amount of focus on the legs, which I know jujitsu has a particular focus on leg work and flexibility and strength. I believe they were actually using jujitsu, which was a lot of fun for me to watch. So when they were fighting each other, they were actually doing real stuff. I'm sure it was scripted, but it was real jujitsu as far as I could tell.
Well, that's actually, you transition into a great point that I wanted to make, was that it was Sakichi Sato who wrote and directed it, or adapted it from the manga. He had the really good sense to for a lot of shots to just let the camera go, just let it run, let the take play out.
Yeah, there
weren't
the actors that many cuts in the fight scenes.
There were.
Yeah. Well, I really liked that, especially when it worked for the drama as well as for the comedy, like in the middle portion when he announces that he has cancer or whatever, which of course we find out he doesn't, which that makes that moment even funnier. But when you don't know that, just the fact that they were able to let the take go long, it made the moment feel a lot more impactful and gave it more weight. So right. I give him a lot of credit for having the restraint for as cartoony and ridiculous as the humor could be, but he really knew the medium of film such that he could show some real restraint and just let a moment play out.
Right. It gives you time to reflect instead of all of a sudden just bang, cutscene.
Yeah, in American cinema in particular, I feel like we cut way too often, and it can kind of, I think a lot of the times it's used as a crutch by the director to say, oh, this isn't working, so let's cut a whole bunch, and that will create the illusion of tension. When in fact the script should, well, when in fact the script should just dictate what happens next with the camera, and so he had the good sense to just let moments play out and to have the dramatic or comedic weight of the moment determine what happens next with the camera.
Okay. So, did anyone else?
Somewhat brief digression on editing. Sometimes when you shoot something, you end up with a lot of additional content that you don't necessarily need, or alternative takes. So I kind of want to advocate for the people who do a lot of editing. I'm
not putting it down by any means, because when I shoot, I do the same thing. I try to get a decent amount of coverage. I don't think you don't want to overcover, because then you waste time. You don't want to undercover without cutaways, because then you could get screwed in the editing room and be stuck with a bad take that you don't want. But
unfortunately, I get a lot of overly run scenes in independent films.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
that can
shit.
happen too. Yeah, that can happen too, but I feel like you got to have some kind of happy medium there. But it I do think there's most definitely a place for shooting for the edit, though, which I've obviously done. But it is just kind of refreshing for when something is supposed to have some weight to it, that you can just let that moment play out and you don't have to artificially create that moment.
Right. I see
That's
what you're saying.
Yeah, that's more what I was trying to get at. But for practicality reasons, believe me, I know full well why you shoot for the edit.
Right. And I mean, I know like depending on who you're working with, like I know some stars do a lot of improv. Like I was listening to the commentary on Deadpool where they were talking about it's like, oh man, like every take he did a different joke and it was impossible to figure out which one to use, you know. So I'm thinking kind of in those sorts of terms when you say, you know, editing is
Well, now that you bring that up, sometimes shooting for the edit when you're in those kind of situations, sometimes it can be painfully obvious what their setup is. Like if like the example that came off the top of my head was there was a scene in the 40-year-old version which I did not like,
Me neither.
but I didn't like it at all. But
I'm sure it
there
sucks.
was
I'm not gonna see it.
there was a scene where Steve Carell, I think, is in a party and someone's trying to talk to him. It was like a 3-camera setup, 3 boring angles, and clearly all 3 cameras are going on at the same time and they're improvising. You can really tell, except that it's actors who are not really accustomed to improv, and so they're just kind of going off and it's not going anywhere. It's not funny. It's not a Christopher Guest movie where those are meant to be improvised like crazy. So when you're talking about shooting for the edit, in a comedic situation, and I'm not talking necessarily even about like a Michael Bay action scene where those are covered by as many cameras as they have, pretty much from every conceivable
Wasn't it
angle
Michael
for for good reason, because you want to have a lot of coverage of that kind of stuff. But
You
when
can
you're
only
talking,
blow up the bus so many times, yeah.
yeah, I mean, well, he can often cut a little too much, but just very basically, when you have a big action scene, you want to get it from a lot of angles, so you have some choices. But when it comes to comedy, and you're trying to shoot that way, where you're trying to capture the improv, that really depends on if you have an actor that can do it. And for this movie, for Tokyo Zombie, I don't think they did anything like that. And it didn't seem like an improv kind of movie. And again, it's virtually impossible for us to tell from a dub. But just in general, if you do that where you have like 2 cameras, shot reverse shot on an actor who's going to improv, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like I'm thinking about another one that really didn't work. If you've ever seen Spider-Man 2, you know the scene in the elevator with the guy who says, you know, cool Spidey outfit and all that. It's a very small little awkward moment in the theatrical cut, and it works a little bit better then. But if you see Spider-Man 2.1, it just goes on and on,
And
and
they drag it out for like another minute, and it's just like awkward and
it's
kind
so
of.
painful to watch. Like I can never watch Spider-Man 2.1 because every time I get there, I want to turn it off and watch the theatrical cut instead. Because but okay, so that's my little rant on when that kind of thing can go wrong.
I just like having more of Doctor Octopus. I mean, I'll forgive like 1 or 2 stupid decisions in the face of several like great ones. Like I personally would like to see. We talked about maybe doing like a sequels episode. I would personally like to see a Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 in which they were able to restore and include the deleted scenes. Because they initially had several scenes that were like that bridge massacre, where they were just like going out and like killing people to like load up the truck with meat, and they cut out, I think, at least 2, almost certainly more sequences of Leatherface just like jumping out from behind corners and like killing people, and like it made the movie so much more interesting. Like especially like there was a film critic who had a cameo in one of those scenes. He just comes around down some stairs with some models, and Leatherface is just like, brrr, and he just like saws them, and he's like, now see, that's like real film violence or something, some stupid throwaway line. and then he gets like sawed too. But I wish some movies could have that editorial freedom to like just include some of the stuff that they cut that they thought wouldn't work. But
Yeah, well, that's what director's cuts are for, and I would like to see more available versions of films for sure. I mean that it usually those other cuts of movies usually are if you have like a director like Ridley Scott who he kind of pioneered the concept of the director's cut on home video. If you have a director like that, if you have usually it's a horror movie that likes to advertise that it's the uncut version, which they add like 2 seconds, or on a rare occasion you'll have a movie that actually is a different film when it's recut. But I generally speaking, I would like to see more versions of films that can be cut in different ways because it does add or detract from the experience.
Yeah,
Anything else?
Like Aliens in particular, with the director's cut, has about 20 more minutes of like exposition comparing the two species, like human reproduction versus xenomorph reproduction, and like kind of the importance of family. And there's even some scenes in that which we found out like Ripley has a daughter, and that kind of adds more to like what she's experiencing and like her character arc or coming to like care for Newt. So like the things that are cut can make a very big difference, even if it's not that much material.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are cut, sometimes they're absolutely not needed.
Yeah, well, in the case of Tokyo Zombie, trying to bring it back here, in the case of this film, I feel like which I would be interested to see what elements of the manga were left out, if any, but it seemed like everything necessary was here to tell a complete story, and that's always a good sign whenever you feel like there's not anything that was either unresolved or just stuff that it just seemed like all the necessary pieces were here for a complete story.
Yeah,
Right.
We got everything we needed. A couple things could have maybe used a little bit more background, but for the most part, it didn't really matter that much.
Nothing
So Dustin,
nothing essential was left off the table.
Did you end up liking Tokyo Zombie?
I personally thought it was fine. I mean, I go through many films in a month, and this was something that I wouldn't. I think I'd maybe give it a 5 out of 10. I mean, like it had a creative concept, but it wasn't necessarily anything remarkable. At least that would stick out in my mind. So I mean, yeah, I'm glad I saw it, so I can say I saw it. But it didn't totally blow me away. Like there were some pretty good jokes that I'll remember. Like when he jumps out of the truck and he just like end over end. One of my friends used to watch certain kinds of videos on YouTube, and his comment would be like physics at its finest. And so it made me think of that, and it was kind of like, huh. So it's like I'm gonna jump out of the truck, I'm sad, and it's like perfectly straight, like falls over. And then like being taught.
I'm gonna try to wrap this up here, but just to let you know, Celeste, I was kind of going in my mind, and Andrew, the other Andrew, suggested for us to do something next week. I know you're not going to be with us for the next episode, but
Right.
I figured about what planning. I guess we're going to try to do, instead of a particular film, we may just do something which I'll call random sequel, where we'll just talk about random sequels and how crazy some of them are.
Okay,
we should try to cover Halloween 3 and Max. I think it's a strong contender.
Yeah, that was a very unique sequel, actually. Well, why don't we talk about that in the next episode?
We should.
Yeah.
In any case, Celeste, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
I'm Celeste. I'm a horror host on Dedgar's Dark Coffin Classics, which is a horror host show out of Wisconsin. So the Kenosha areas particularly, but we are kind of all over. If you want to see our stuff, go to vimeo.com/ddcc. And I'm also the host for the Glamour Junkies Burlesque Troupe out of Milwaukee.
Awesome.
What?
Since
I can't hear that.
You have a show coming up for the Glamour Junkies pretty soon, correct?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Can you share some details?
For the burlesque show?
Yes.
Yes, our next show is on November 4th at Frank's Power Plant, I believe. It'll be Halloween Hangover. I'm pretty excited about it.
Sounds pretty
so
good.
definitely check that out, Milwaukeeans, if you can check that out. In any case, Andrew, since you're new to the show, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Nowak, and I know Dustin through college. I specialize in a couple of somewhat eclectic things. I have a degree in outdoor education. I depending on what season it is, I'm an outdoor guide. So I do winter camping. I do canoe trips in the Boundary Waters in Canada, up in the Quetico provincial wilderness. I have a lot of interest in both performing arts and things like just your standard arts like painting and whatnot. As I mentioned earlier, I also kind of dabble in the martial arts as well. So if you can tag arts onto it or the outdoors, I have at least looked into it. Zombies have always, in my late teens and now even, have always been a particular interest of mine, not necessarily because I enjoy it personally, because it's been such a interesting social interaction. I've personally run, 3 games of Humans versus Zombies through a college campus. Each game, I'd say, averaging about 100 players. And that was a week-long game each. And then more recently, this very weekend, I was part of a zombie LARP. So zombies actually keep coming up in my life just as an incidental thing that it's really, really fun for me to just jump into it and run rather than me actually seeking it out. So this particular movie was an interesting add-on to that particular intrusion of zombies into my life.
Cool. Well, glad that it could add something to your life.
Yeah.
And then,
See,
might as well keep running. I love being culturally relevant if I can help it. And zombies
thank you.
always been big, so at least.
Well, thank you for coming on the show and participating, and hopefully we can have you back on an episode.
I look forward to it.
Dane, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
All right. I am Dane Kyle, independent filmmaker out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And you can check out my work on my YouTube channel, The Dane Kyle, Keil. And there you can check out my German expressionist silent film, Aeternus, which screened on Dedgar's Dark Coffin Classics recently. Thank you, Celeste. And it also got into the American Horrors Film Festival, which Celeste is hosting, and that'll be very exciting. Anybody that's going to attend, you'll have to let me know how it's received. Very excited to know that.
I will be there, so I will.
Thank you, because it's a little bit out of the way for me. But anyway, you can check out my film there. Check out the trailer for my film noir, The Big Blind, which will be hopefully coming out of post-production hell sooner than later. Which I know it's still in post-production. Anyway, And then this last weekend, I just finished shooting a horror short film, which will hopefully be included in the. I got to finish it before November 1st, but it'll hopefully be included in the upcoming horror anthology feature film called For We Are Many from Hex Media. Hex Media, they did The Black Gloves recently, Lord of Tears, and The Unkindness of Ravens. So definitely stay tuned for that. Hopefully I'll get in, working hard to make sure I do, but that would certainly be a big boon for me. But as far as connections, you can connect me on Facebook, Twitter, anywhere you can find me.
Most definitely. I put money into the Unkindness of Ravens Kickstarter and the Black Gloves Kickstarter as well. So definitely looking forward to if your short film goes the anthology. In any case, Dustin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Yeah, Dane, be sure to add Andrew because he's very much into short films. Less so these days, but it's sort of a specialty of his. So,
well, you can definitely check out Dane's on YouTube at his YouTube location. So
Excellent.
Yeah, you can friend me too, and I'll send it to you.
Wonderful.
You will get lots of stickers. Anyway, well, I'm Dustin. Dustin Nelson. I attend UWM here in Milwaukee, and I'm studying programming and geographic information systems. And I don't have any particular background in film. I just have a unreasonably large movie collection, and so I'm always willing to talk films. And yeah, this is a pretty fun thing for me. Yeah.
Cool.
I don't necessarily have anything to plug besides my eBay store, which is empty at the moment. So, yeah.
That's good, right? Right?
No, it's bad. It's really bad. Buy my stuff.
And my name is David Strege. I run Movies Galore of Milwaukee, which is a group, as well as the name of my blog, which I write in. But I also I also am the host here. So thank you all for being patient with me and enjoying these films with me. I'm also a somewhat small-time producer. Once again, one of the films that I helped produce is coming out in 2018 with director Brad Twigg, Wrestle Massacre. Definitely check that out.
It's like it's like WrestleMania, except people die.
Wow.
It actually stars the
son.
Like the wrestler.
the son of. So, in any case, hopefully that will come out sometime next year or sometime soon. In any case, hopefully you guys have enjoyed yourselves.
I always enjoy myself.
So have a good evening, and definitely, if there's any movies that you want to suggest or anything, please feel free.
And remember, remember, kids, always use subtitles and always shoot for the edit.
Take that.
In any case, thanks for listening, folks. Have a good evening. Everyone say goodbye.
Bye.